I went to the Cementa Festival, which is a festival in a small town in New South Wales, and made a reservation at the hotel. And the person who picked up the phone said, "Are you an artist? What kind of art?" And I said, "I'm an installation artist." They knew exactly what that was. And that was really surprising. I thought, I'm going to the right place.
Yeah, that's the place for you. Welcome to the Installation Art Podcast, the world's #1 podcast about installation art and the people who work with it. In this show, you will hear about the joys and challenges of the medium and get an exclusive look at the career and process of internationally renowned guests. I am your host, Anastasia Parmson. My guest today is Australian artist Elizabeth Day, a cross-disciplinary visual artist and activist with a practice spanning over 30 years. Elizabeth's work is deeply connected to Australia's colonial history and the ongoing impact of places of incarceration, both on physical landscapes and through generations of trauma. She's developed powerful collaborative projects in spaces often overlooked, such as prisons, working with inmates. Elizabeth's process is about unraveling, both literally and metaphorically, to create what she refers to as performative textile paintings and sculptures. I'm very excited to introduce my conversation with Elizabeth Day. Let's go back to a few decades ago, maybe.
Sure.
To your beginnings. You've had a very long and multifaceted career.
Right.
Tell me a bit about how you grew up and how did you discover art?
Well, I think drawing was always a pretty natural, drawing and making. I've got very creative parents. You know, it was just what you did. It wasn't like it was good or bad. You just kind of did it. And it was so of interest in the general conversation. So that was always there. But people thought I was a good drawer. I probably went to art school because I was the best drawer in the class, which seems really odd now. That seems so sort of old-fashioned and weird. But you were sort of singled out in a particular way. I didn't really think about it, though I always made things and did things until later. Yeah, so I grew up in this sort of creative family, but we were migrants. We migrated when I was 9 years of age to Tasmania.
Okay.
And that brought about a lot of upheaval and transformation. And my family bought a property which is along the Derwent River, and they became the first hydroponic farmers in Tasmania. They were very resourceful people, and my father had been a mechanical engineer, designed machines, which I think was why the sort of visual imagination always was important. It was just imagining things and making things kind of was normal, even though they didn't have an artistic sort of training or background, or I wasn't born into a cultured family at all that would support the kind of practice that I do now.
Is there something from your childhood that had an impact on you as an artist today?
Oh, I think definitely migrating was huge. And even though I migrated from the UK, the whole transplanting of a life from one side of the world to another is a huge, anyone who's done it. And there's this sort of idea, I think, that once you've left, you can never return. So you're always in this sort of state of motion, which I think is equivalent to the creative process, that you're always alive and alert and you have to respond to a new set of circumstances. So, and my parents had to regroup their whole business, and they came up with this particular sort of very inventive in the 70s form of horticulture. And actually that kind of artifice of the hydroponic system, nature being moulded and you can grow things out of season and all that. And it's a system that you plug into and you can manufacture life almost. It was emblematic of the sort of artifice of what I felt the life was as a migrant. Anyway, that was just sort of background stuff. But I just had a regular education and...
You studied art, though. You have a PhD, don't you?
Oh, yes, but I started to study art when I was much younger, yes. I studied painting. Actually, I came out of painting and I moved into... Yes, I wrote a PhD about migration, discontinued narratives of migration. And a lot of the installations that are on the earth with grass and cast grassroots and carpet in several different locations, that was about migration. They were about the idea of transplanting a life. And also, because we moved to Tasmania, I became very interested in the history of that state. And it was a huge impact to discover that, as we were told at that time, that was in the late 60s, that all the Indigenous people had been killed. And so I found that quite horrendous. And yeah, it was very emotionally impacting to learn that I was in a place where they'd killed all these people off.
So you said you started off painting. What led you to start making installation work?
Well, I still actually do regard my installations as a kind of painting, even though I'm painting with other stuff. As I studied art, I felt that painting was a kind of... It had such a masculine history. The more I learned about, feminist art, yeah, it was a masculine history. Some painters, have survived history, but by and large, and I think that I was always kind of conflicted about the artist as this kind of special person, who was male, who was out there. And I found artfulness in a lot of processes like gardening. My mother had an amazing garden, which was about 3 acres, where she built her English garden that sort of merged into the bush. And I think of that as a very artful, creative way that she integrated into Australian life as a migrant. And I suppose a lot of migrants have found similar ways that they brought their knowledge and understanding and culture from another place. And painting was what I learned when I first did art training. That was in Tasmania, and Tasmania's changed a lot, but it was very watercolour oriented and landscape. And there was a school of abstraction, which I studied with a teacher. It was an Austrian teacher, actually, Anton Holzner. But I always felt disconnected from that, actually. And it wasn't until, I don't know, you go through years of kind of confusion. I remember the first installation that I did, I was probably about 18. And once when my family were away for a weekend, I moved all the furniture out of my bedroom and painted the walls. I just found scraps of paint, and I knew it was really naughty to do that. And I tried not to spill paint on anything to create damage, but I did this kind of it was quite a dark sort of Neo Geo kind of wall installation in my bedroom, which, my parents were kind of aghast when they came back. They thought that I probably needed some help.
Right.
But whatever compelled me to do that, I only thought about that about 6 months ago. It was something about the need to externalize. I was going through a lot, as you do at that age, and to externalize that. Yeah, so that was probably the beginning.
So what was your first opportunity or a solo show, or how did you first get to showing installation work?
Well, it wasn't until much later. As I said, I studied painting, and I was living in Hobart and kind of going crazy because there were no female role models at that stage. It was very conservative, very, very conservative. And somehow I went to live in London for a year.
Somehow.
long story.
Right. Okay.
But I was compelled to, it was partly about returning to where I'd grown, where I kind of should be. London. I was taken from actually Liverpool in the north to the backwoods of Tasmania in the 60s when, it was all happening in the music scene.
Mm-hmm.
Liverpool was amazing. And I was in the dark woods of Tasmania learning about all the horrible history there, which really cruel and violent history, and feeling very frustrated, I think. And then when I went to London, I just remember arriving there and suddenly this weight lifted off my back and I found my way into the London art scene. I made friends with a bunch of artists and was suddenly having the most amazing time.
I found your crowd.
I found a crowd who were making art that really made sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Really made sense. And that was all art that was present. Drawing on walls was nothing. There was a lot of attention at that time on a place called Greenham Common. There was a very active women's scene. And I became part of that and found a connection with art and politics in a way that really made sense to me. I just realised I'd been very stultified in Hobart. So that I didn't exhibit in London. That would have been, I was very unformed, and I went back to Sydney and did postgrad at Sydney College.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when I started to do works that were installations. So I started exhibiting in artist-run spaces. At that time, there was, to think about art and money, that was despicable. That was...
Right. Taboo.
Absolutely. And I had a very uncompromising, critical way of viewing the world. I really thought it was all shit, and I was angry, and so the whole gallery thing I just thought was not where I wanted to be. And it was much more important to work with other artists to build this kind of other culture. There were two artists, Roseanne McGreevy and Barbara Halnan, who have now passed away, unfortunately, but they initiated a lot of artist-run projects, and I worked with them on, there was a thing called the Viaduct Project in Annandale, where I did my first big unraveling work.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, they organised with the Annandale Council to have, there were about 8 or 9 artists who each had one of the arches of the viaduct. And that went for about a month, and we got funding to do that. So the idea of artists coming together to make something happen was very energising in that you could do it. You don't have to wait to be asked, just do it. I loved that sort of attitude. It seemed that you had to be in certain social spheres in the art world, and you had to, I don't know, I was an outsider. I hadn't gone to a good private school in Sydney. I didn't have any social connections in Sydney. So there was no way I was going to find my way into some sort of established exhibiting situation. But there was just a group of people at that time who did stuff just regardless, like just do it, which is a very sort of punk, it was post-punk sort of attitude, and you don't have to have the skills, you just have the attitude and you make things happen. And that's, I still feel that very much. I've had some opportunities lately, but basically you create things for yourself if you need to make art. And I've always had a sort of need to make art, I think. And also I think that Viaduct project taught me how, making art in public spaces that works with the big space of being in Australia, actually. That's one thing. When I came back from London, I almost stayed there, but it was the big space in Australia that I felt I missed. And I've always thought Yeah, making art that belongs in Australia is about involving space.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still very much part of my practice. And I've incorporated a lot about prisons and the arrival of the prison wall in this country. But it's still about space and big space. And it's also an acknowledgement of it being an Indigenous country that has 60,000 years. And I'm just a blow-in British person who's got 200 years history here. And I would like to acknowledge that very powerfully in my practice, that that's the case. So, yeah, making a work that related to a public piece of architecture like a viaduct was really inspiring, and, you could see it for miles.
Yeah, visually impactful.
Yeah, and that it's art that kind of melds with the space, the environment. I like that, and takes into account the history around it too.
So would you say that your work is usually site-specific?
Yeah.
Made for the...
Oh, absolutely. Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
In my PhD, one of the focal artists was Robert Smithson, who works with earth art and history and environmental issues, and he's a sort of important reference point.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned prisons.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. How did you come to that topic, and how have you explored it in your work?
Okay, well, I've made my living, basically, and I've made art by being sometimes a sessional teacher. And then at some stage, I got offered a teaching gig in a prison at Long Bay Correctional Centre. And there were a whole lot of artists who were actually working in prisons at that time. There was a sort of foment of thinking about, it was kind of radical, kind of anti-psychiatry in a way, how creativity can be used to manifest changes in behaviour, which I still very much see happening and am interested in that possibility. I think art is a sort of transformational activity.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I had this kind of sessional art teaching in a prison, and quite a lot of the prisons around New South Wales are still 19th century, very much like time hasn't moved on.
Really?
Yeah, there are new prisons, but certain places. And once I had a class of a whole bunch of Indigenous guys, and I thought, how crazy is this? Here am I, this white woman, with an art class of Indigenous people in a building that looks like an English castle. And I found it really disgusting. And I set about trying to work on a project that addressed that within the system. And fortunately, I had some support from one of the senior administrators who gave me some money to develop it was kind of a public artwork within the prison. And I tried to encourage research with this group of inmates.
So it was like a collaborative project with the inmates?
Yes, it was. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Getting them to design gardens that we could actually make that addressed the history of the site. It was so difficult. Anyone who knows that environment, which is very restrictive, yes, it was very difficult. But, there was a little bit of success, and the garden actually lasted, and they made designs based on some of the animals that were their totem. It wasn't, it worked. It worked to a degree, and it was the idea of addressing the landscape underneath these British structures. The prison was the reason the British came here, to put their surplus of criminals and to have a sort of slave workforce to build the colony so the French couldn't get their hands on this country. So the prison was Australia's raison d'etre, and I was interested that I was in this situation where I could actually address that. And to a degree it worked. There were a whole lot of bureaucratic reasons why it was extremely difficult, but something about that situation had to be addressed. So that idea came to me through that. And the exhibition Dreams Nursed in Darkness that's on at Wollongong at the moment that I've co-curated with Claire Taylor, that is still one of the underlying aspects of that show.
Yeah, so the theme continues throughout
The theme
your
continues.
career.
It's like, once you've seen this kind of horror, this incongruity of British law and Indigenous law that manifests right there, and huge numbers of Indigenous people unjustly in prison for reasons of, their history is so damaged, and there should be just a lot more attention given to making that right. Yeah, the exhibition in Wollongong includes some really important Aboriginal artists like Carla Dickens and Leanne Tobin and Megan Cope, who are also thinking in that area of damage. Yeah, the trauma. I like to think that the projects that I've done recently are giving recognition to the early trauma that the prison brought. It was like a wound on the Australian landscape, and it's something that we can't get away from. It's going to be very difficult to reconcile. That still is. It's we just had a referendum that most of the population voted no, not recognising that damage, and so that concerns me.
Mm. Tell me a bit about the materials. How do you decide what material to use for a particular project? Because you've used a lot of textile. Let's talk about the unraveling a bit.
Well, the unraveling started in late 1990s, and I made a huge textile which wrapped around the viaduct. It wrapped around one of the pylons, and it started off as a parody of Jackson Pollock's drip paintings.
Really?
Yeah. So I always felt that I was kind of a painter, but it didn't feel right to use paint. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, it somehow just started. I'd unravel loads of op shop jumpers and have piles of red and piles of yellow, piles of blue, piles of all these colours, and like a palette, and then made the textile. So the unravelled tendrils had a really nice kind of drip quality. So it was kind of fun, and I had a number of friends who were unravelling for me. Mm-hmm. I'd have a little sort of unravelling party.
And then you just sort the curly...
Yeah, I don't know how it came together.
By colour.
Yeah, no, it just sort of, I put it on a backing, and I just loved all these colours all on it was paint, because I love working with colour, but the history of painting kind of didn't work for me. Mm-hmm. Didn't work I couldn't find a way to do it, and maybe I could now, but I painted also with chewing gum for quite a long time.
Oh.
That I did a whole...
On canvas?
On Hessian, because it had to have that sort of poverty. I wanted always to recognise that there was this kind of underside of life.
Is that chewing gum you would chew yourself, or did you have volunteers?
I had some volunteers too. But my dentist eventually told me that I shouldn't do it anymore. So I haven't done any for a while. No, it's bad for the teeth.
Really? That's surprising. Okay. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, but no, they were mixed. Like I'd buy a whole lot of brands and mix them. These colours are quite subtle.
So you kind of mixed your own colours too.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, so I was painting, and people think it's quite a nice, like a Fred Williams-y kind of bush painting or something, and then they look at it and go, oh, chewing gum.
Yeah.
And so there was part of me that this kind of abject, this icky thing was always, I wanted to draw attention to something that was sort of icky. It felt like a lot wasn't said. This sort of underside, or painting was all about tastefulness and putting nice paintings into expensive houses and collectors, and all that just seemed kind of, nah. That's not me. That's not why I want to make art. I think I had a bug about, just being an agent of change, actually. I really did. I really wanted things to be different. I wanted the world to be different. And what was the point of making a nice painting, really?
You're an activist.
In a way, but I also do have this sort of quite powerful aesthetic sense that, I do want to be articulate. I wanted to be funny even. I wanted to make it into some story that was palatable and interesting. So I've never quite been able to know whether I do write short stories, and I think the art comes out of short story writing in a way, or writing and research. I want to make something that's entertaining or very clear and lucid. Yeah. Like I find that the chewing gum paintings, which I call cosmos, so it's like the world of the pavement, this kind of thinking about, I was probably not far from being homeless myself at the time, and this sort of underprivilege, and then there was working in a prison, that sort of underprivilege and stuff that's neglected, a whole aspect of life that's neglected. It kind of worked for me to be in that space, to actually be in that space. I think of installation as a kind of performance. So I was authentically in that space when I was doing that work.
So what would you like the audience to take away from experiencing your work?
I'd like to think they ask some uncomfortable questions about the way reality is. And I think very much that, there's just not enough recognition, say, of the damage done to Indigenous people. And it's gradually changing, and gradually we're acknowledging Indigenous culture. But also poverty and a lot of underprivilege. I think prisons are often manifestations of underprivilege. But no, I've always had a very profound, there's a lot of inequality. I'm profoundly a socialist.
How do you deal with the impermanence of installation as a medium? What happens to the work after an exhibition is over?
Well, like all the grass installations, they all long disintegrated. I might keep parts that I could recycle. I've got a storage unit.
Right, yeah. How about the textiles? Do you reuse parts of it for something else?
No, I kind of made a promise to myself that I would just keep recycling all the stuff that's in my storage unit. I can just stop making more crap.
Yeah.
That's filling spaces and filling the environment. And to some extent, I've stuck to that. But I've also, I have shown with commercial galleries. I showed for a long time with the Connie Deachol Gallery, who was very supportive of the work that I did. And now I've just started showing with Hilary Mays. And I've started making, some of the works, the textiles that I made that are sections of a prison wall, such as the work in Wollongong. They're framed and they actually are quite houseable. But people still, I think, find textile and unraveled garments not quite as desirable to purchase as a painting. Still, painting is the supremo.
Oh, yeah. If you go to an art fair, 90% of it is painting.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why I'm really keen to go travel back to the UK is to see that I think that's not the case. There's textile biennales and they're sort of next level of work. There are a couple of major textile shows in Australia, but it's still down here. Painting's up here. I don't know whether it's a sort of feminized thing, but it's still not quite.
Well,
art.
From what I've heard from previous guests who are in the States, textile artists, textile is really having a moment right now, and it's becoming really popular in contemporary art.
Yes.
More and more people use it as a medium.
I think that's true. And I can think of a lot of Australian artists too, but that's not really translated into the sort of commercial gallery world of saleability.
So you make these framed fragments of the textile. Are they sold individually?
Yeah,
or is it
I have done. I've sold them individually.
So they're kind of almost like a zoom in of this huge
that's right.
20-meter piece or something.
Yeah, that's right. So I don't think that's, I don't feel compromised by doing that. And, there's a lot of artists, a lot of European artists who make installation and then they have their stuff that they might sell, photographs framed or whatever. I don't feel conflicted about that as I once did. But it's still a process emerges because it has meaning. And so the unravelling, this kind of almost Fluxus-like performance that is this sort of crazy wish to unravel the history or to transform something with the old op-shop garments that I don't wash them, so they've got sort of DNA and it's a bit stinky and memories in these little crinkles. That meaning, that activity is really potent. It's more potent than I could envisage doing with an actual painting, with paint on a palette. I think it's part of my family were great stitchers, knitters and all that. So I feel a connection to this sort of fibre and these kind of domestic activities which make sense to me. And even the grass casts that I've made, which I probably should say what they are.
Yeah.
That's an interesting story. I started making grass casts as a result of finding on an electricity metal manhole cover that had an indent that said electricity, some grass roots that had gone into the shape of these letters. And it said elect. It was part of the word electricity. And I picked it up and I thought, oh my God, this is so interesting.
Yeah.
And that was actually in the grounds when I was doing the garden project in the prison. And it made me think of, the transplanting of grass to Australia, the lawn, which came with the early prisons. The English wanted to civilise this wild country, and so they'd put a beautiful lawn around the prison. So I actually reconfigured that process. I made casts in plaster with wooden blocks, mirror imaged, and grew grass in those plaster casts and then peeled them off, and they came out like a print the right way.
Mm.
And
so the roots created
text.
Yeah.
And I like this idea of this language, a thin layer of language, which the lawn was on this ancient country. Anne Finnegan said I did the unconscious of the lawn, which I like that. I love the idea that I've done the unconscious of the lawn in my grass casts. So I did a whole big show called Liverpool at Casula and in Liverpool, UK, where I was born. I made a lot of these grass casts of places, and I actually made casts of the writing of 4 migrant writers who lived around Casula. And again, a layer of language on an ancient country. So that was a very big project, and I did a component in Liverpool, UK, which was also a very fascinating journey to go back to near to where I was born.
So like a parallel project across the globe.
Liverpool. There's a curator, Paul Howard, who sent me to a gallery in Liverpool, UK. I feel as though I'm making this story up, but he sent me to this place called St George's Hall, which is a big building like QVB in Sydney, a Victorian masterpiece of sandstone with British lions and all kinds of emblems of the empire. Amazingly, I discovered a room. There's a law court there, which is now a museum, and I discovered in one of these rooms an engraving of this guy who looked a lot like my father. It turned out that he was my great-great-great-grandfather.
Wow.
Amazing, yeah. I researched and I asked I was going over there to a 90th birthday party, so I've had a lot of very ancient relatives. They could tell me about this that I never knew about, that this guy was my forebear. And I think that he was probably sending convicts to Australia. So I thought, here I am doing these installations about prisons and the evils of the British legal system in Australia. And it's almost like, because he was known as a hanging judge, so he'd actually killed a lot of people. And
Wow.
Yeah, but that's just what they did in those days, judges, for not much. No, it just sort of I thought, oh gosh, this is kind of destiny playing its part. Yeah, and I still need to find out more about that. That was sort of early 19th century, which is when they were, in fact, sending convicts to Australia. Yeah, so that installation in 2 cities, that was a demanding thing to achieve, but I did it.
How long would it take to get the grass to grow enough to get that imprint?
Oh, about 2 or 3 months.
So is that how long you spent in Liverpool?
No, I didn't do that grass. I showed a film, actually. I showed a film that I'd been able to make of the garden in the Dilwinia prison, the garden that I did with inmates. So I showed a film there.
Okay.
In a corridor that was a dungeon type of place. No, that would have been a logistical, to have all that time there. I wouldn't have been able to afford that. It would have been nice to do that. But anyway, it was just a sort of emblem of the work that I'd been doing in prisons that I exhibited. So that use of geographical space and recognising the impact of a place of birth and being an Australian is, it's a theme that I'll probably go back to. We bring all our histories from all the parts of the world, and it's all being lived out now in Australia in the present. So that's all very rich and interesting how that's going to play out, I think.
I've heard that you've had your studio in some interesting places. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Or what does your studio look like at the moment?
Actually, at the moment, I'm in the Waverley Studios in Bondi.
Oh, nice.
Kind of. It's very small, but it's good. It's near to where I'm living at the moment. And yes, before that, I was in Carriage Works in the clothing factory. So I was spoiled for a large space, and that was amazing. I wish there was a lot more possibility of artists in Sydney having really decent spaces like that.
Yeah, and subsidised studio space.
Subsidised, yes. It almost makes me want to just be an activist for artists and the terrible neglect that we suffer in the city of Sydney, this wonderful affluent, because that's,
I know. I was just having a conversation with somebody who creates opportunities for artists, and they were talking about how they want to prioritize rural artists who don't necessarily have access to all the spaces in Sydney CBD. And I'm like, I live in central Sydney and I don't have access to all the spaces in Sydney CBD. It's similar. You can be in the midst of it all, but you're still kind of an outsider, or you can't afford.
No,
just priced out.
No, the prices are outrageous in Sydney, and I used to have a studio in Parramatta Road, and a lot of artists did, but that's all been the redevelopments are moving up Parramatta Road. And
right. They've sold them all off to development.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of artists are moving out to the mountains and beyond because it's just becoming impossible, which is a real... I did have, in the 90s, I had Green Street, Australia Council Studio, and I met New York artists who were living in a building. They had apartments, nice apartments and workplaces at subsidised rates. The city acknowledged how important culture was to that city and subsidised creative people. I don't know whether that's still happening.
I hear that artists are also priced out of New York now and they're moving out of New York City.
Yeah. Yes. When I talk about artist-run spaces in the late 80s, 90s, and there's still a lot of artist-run spaces, but yeah, it seemed more doable.
Yeah. So you've been making art for quite a while now, working in Australia, and you're now at a stage where you're maybe having a bit of a moment in your career. What's this experience been like for you?
Oh, it's been very rewarding to actually have a little bit of a voice.
What would you say has been the proudest moment of your career so far?
I was very proud of the work that I did for the National, that large unravelling work. And I'm also very proud of the Dreams Nursed in Darkness at Wollongong and actually the show that I'm in at Sydney University, the Fauvet Oreo show. And no, I just feel as though what I'm doing is kind of culminating in a really good way at the moment. And I've got a show at Bathurst Regional Gallery in 2026, so that's a large show. No, I'm just feeling strongly that I've got the process and the understandings, I think, to make work in a way that's kind of just consolidating what my vision is as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really looking forward to getting back to writing after the last 2 years I've solidly had exhibitions, and I just like to go back to writing and researching again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that part of your artistic practice or is that like a side thing?
No, it's part of my artistic practice.
Mm-hmm.
And the writing is becoming more integrated into those textiles as well. Yeah. And also I work with a group called the Longford Project, which is myself and Anna Gibbs, Noeline Lucas and Julie Goff, the Tasmanian Indigenous. And we research, well, as it happens, crimes around that small town in Tasmania, colonial, early 19th century violence that occurred around that town.
Mm-hmm.
And it's based on the idea that Australia is a crime scene. So we make short movies that are projected onto the inner walls of a crime scene tent. We've got a crime scene tent in the Wollongong show, which, it's an actual crime scene tent, and these short throw projectors go onto the four walls. And that's an ongoing project.
Mm-hmm.
My 3 colleagues are actually related through their colonial histories, personal, genealogical, to that town. And I've yet to discover what my connection to Tasmania is. So I lived there for about 20 years. I suspect that my great-great-great-grandfather was probably sending them to Tasmania. There's sort of a fascination with putting that history together. But also, that project's acknowledging again that violence that is under the carpet a lot in Australia. There's, more and more research about all the massacres in New South Wales, and David Marr wrote a fantastic book called Killing for Country, where he discovered that his forebears were part of these killing parties who just went out and slaughtered groups with impunity, and there was nothing said. And I strongly believe that sort of deep trauma embedded in Australia needs to be processed, come out. Yeah, so there's lots to do.
Do you think that your practice is part of processing that trauma?
Unraveling, the crazy unraveling, kind of, yeah. Recognising the prison as a site of damage, yes, it is. Yeah, definitely. I do see that. And the texts that I've embedded in these walls are recognising trauma that I'm trying to transform with the colours and, make them something different. But, yeah, definitely recognising the pain that is in that architecture. And, yeah, no, that's, transgenerational trauma. There's much to be researched further in that. And recognising my own generational trauma, I suppose, that we all have to some extent. But institutions thread through my family in all kinds of bizarre and interesting ways. So looking at the institution as a site of, they don't have to be damaging, but they often have been. I think there's a lot of Northern European countries. I look to that kind of processing of crime as they seem to have arrived at better ways of doing it to most, America and Australia.
Tell me about an obstacle or a challenge you've encountered in your career.
Oh, gosh, I feel as though it's all been an obstacle and a challenge. It's just been, I don't know where to begin.
Have you ever wanted to quit art?
Oh, yes, I did get a job. I got a full-time job for a couple of years. I think it's not a job that you choose. It chooses you.
Yeah.
And anyone who can get out of it should.
Oh my God, I feel that so hard. I'm like, yeah, I can't get out.
Yeah. It's just I've had reasonable success with public funding and also just had part-time jobs. So just that kind of juggle of a double life of having to keep it all together.
Yeah, to be a functioning human in society, but also making art that is...
Yeah, so when you ask about how weird do I feel, well, you try to keep that at bay. I mean, it would be just fantastic to just be an artist, actually.
Yeah.
And perhaps that'll happen. But no, I feel I've been reasonably uncompromising with the way I've made it work. But it would be amazing just to have 7 days a week that you just did that.
The ability to be a full-time professional artist without all the other noise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever had moments where you feel like, this is it, I've made it?
Oh, fairly fleetingly. Like at the moment, I'm very proud of Dreams Nursed in Darkness with Claire Taylor. Yeah, so for a week or two, you probably sort of bask in the comfort that I've made 3 quite major works this year, and I'm pleased with them all. So I'm exhausted at the moment.
Yeah. Look, basking for a week or two in my mind is great, because for me it's a lot shorter.
Right.
Good.
Yeah, no, I'd like to have a holiday for about a month. But you sort of decide, oh, maybe that's it. I've done it now. That's good. I can just go and do all those fun things and not have to spend all those hours getting shows organised. But I guess then you have a good idea. You have another good idea. And you go, oh, yeah, that'd be good. And then it starts again.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
At what point would you say you know that you belong in the art world, and have you ever felt close to that?
I think one of the things about, I think people love working in art institutions because it gives that sort of sense of belonging to an art community. And also I find when you get funded for a project, you feel like you're being taken care of. Even though I think Australia Council grants for a new work, it's still $20,000, which it was the same as that 20 years ago. $20,000 seemed to be a lot of money back then.
It hasn't changed in 20 years.
I think not.
Wow.
Yeah. But even getting $5,000, it does make you feel that somebody gives a damn whether you do it or not. So funding does definitely make you feel you're not entirely crazy. But, I mean, that hasn't actually stopped me from doing things that I felt compelled to do. And do I feel part of the art world? Yes, I suppose I do. When I go to some events and I know a lot of people and I feel connected, yeah, to some extent I do feel there is an art world. But I'm very ambivalent about that, you know, because it's such a, it's just such a precarious world. And people, you know, you have a little bit of luck and then there's a drought for 5 years. So there's a lot of people who are doing it tough. And I guess I've always had a sort of ambivalent attitude to the sort of affluence of the art world too. Increasingly, I think kids who go to art school are probably from, you know, good leafy suburbs on the North Shore. So I sort of wonder, you know, it's about sort of making stuff that looks good in houses. I'm quite disparaging of a lot of the art business kind of thing. So I don't really feel necessarily that I want to be part of the art world. But you sort of need to be because that's where your peculiar language operates as well. Where else are you going to show chewing gum paintings or grassroot art?
Exactly.
And people will take an interest and, you know, so I was just thinking back about my work about migration. I did a lot of these grass carpets that were site-specific, responding to various locations. I did quite a number of those. You know, and a lot of artists, I think, are sort of transient. They have to move or, you know, do residencies or get studios, move about. And at a certain point, I got really sick of that. And I built a studio in Tasmania on Bruny Island. And I've still got that. That's kind of like one of my home bases. Peace and quiet away from the art world.
Is that where you'd go to have a holiday?
Maybe. Yeah, I want to go down there and just do some writing, think about it all.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And also it's like it takes you back to, in this environment, it's a reminder of nature. Yeah, as most people are very concerned that the icebergs are melting and how long is life going to continue? So it's a place where you can think on what's happening globally, which is really great. That architecture actually came out of my PhD, Discontinued Narratives of Migration, and it's almost like a packing case. It's a sort of movable structure.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's solar powered, and it's just a delightful place to be, to do some thinking, writing, making work. And I might make another studio at Candos. So,
yeah, I hear a lot of artists are moving over there.
Yeah.
So you might be one of them.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. Now, looking back at your journey,
Yeah.
what's one piece of advice you would give to emerging artists who are starting to experiment with installation art?
I think definitely, I've always done processes that I've enjoyed. Like I wasn't getting anything else out of it. You have to make something that's really enjoyable and meaningful. That's what you do it for, I think. Don't do it unless you can avoid it. To start with, go and get another profession that brings you some money. But I actually think that artists have responsibility. I think it's a responsible job.
Yeah.
Yeah. So make it count. Yeah, try to make it count. Do something that's really going to make a difference, make people think, be a profound contribution. Yeah, have fun doing it too. Yeah, it has to be fun, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't do it, right?
No, and it's that sort of surplus of energy communicates to people.
If you had a magic wand and time, geography, money was not a consideration, what would be your dream project to make?
Well, I'm actually looking forward to working on a retrospective exhibition, which I've got in 2026.
Is that what you're doing at Bathurst?
Yeah. Great. And actually bringing all the components under one roof.
Yeah, wow.
Of what I've done, because they do all have a strong relationship with each other. Mm-hmm. I found when I wrote my PhD that was in fact the case, and I researched and was able to go further into the thinking of all the work. Yeah, so to really articulate, because you don't know what you're doing, actually. I don't think I always know what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. I would like to think that I'm not just, what the hell, why did I do that? I'm not quite sure what moved me to go to such lengths. It's very mysterious, actually. It is weird, and once you sort of think you have a good idea, you want to take it to the nth degree and make it really, really powerful to really make the idea work. So, yeah, bringing all the work together, that would be good. And I've got a lot of writing to do. But I guess it would be great I'd like to get commissions. I'd love to get commissioned to do public works.
Oh, public art.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, putting it out there to people who are listening, this day is available for public art commissions.
Yeah. Yes. I think with a certain amount of experimentation that I could translate some of my work into other permanent materials.
Yeah, I'm actually interviewing somebody soon whose job it is to help artists translate their work into permanent public art.
Oh, so. I should meet them, definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there are, I think the work with unraveled garments, they actually last for a long time under glass if you keep the bugs out of them. But, yeah, no, there are good solutions to making things, casting things in metal or whatever. Yeah, no, so that would be really interesting.
Well, I'll send you that interview once it's out and you can learn more about
thank you.
What they do and who they are.
Yeah, because I think that's a lot of the issue with working the way that I do. But it's also been, I've had a very uncompromising, if I find a process that's really working for me aesthetically and conceptually, then that's far more important than it being saleable, actually. I think I've been funded by the Australia Council because it's been quite an uncompromising activity that I've engaged in. And also, part of my practice is community arts. So I do work with groups of people as part of my thing. So,
where can people find out more about you and your work? Maybe see some examples of it?
I've got a website, elizabeth-day.com, and Hilary May's gallery, yeah. And also I'm currently exhibiting at the Wollongong City Gallery till the 24th of November.
Okay, what do you have coming up?
I'm going to have a quiet period until 2026, so I'm just going to go and be writing and producing, I think, in that time, unless something really amazing happens. I feel in the mood to just have a little rest and think.
You've been working hard.
Yeah, yeah.
And then people can stay tuned for the retrospective.
That's right.
In 2026. Do you have social media that you want people
Elizabeth Day 28 on Instagram.
Okay, well, we'll put all that in the show notes so people can click and find you.
Yeah.
You also have a book?
I do. I think there's a link on the website. That's available through the gallery.
Great.
Henry Mays.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks so much for taking the time to come and talk to me.
Thank you for your airing of the obscure lives of installation artists.
That was Elizabeth Day, based in Sydney. You can find out more about her work on her website, elizabethdayart.wordpress.com, and on her Instagram at elizabethday28. Elizabeth is represented by Mays Wright Gallery. If you're located around Sydney, you can see her work in person at Wollongong Art Gallery until 24th of November 2024. And stay tuned for her big retrospective exhibition at Bathurst Regional Art Gallery in 2026. Links to everyone mentioned in this episode are in the show notes and on our website, installationartpodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening. Subscribing helps us grow and gain visibility, and it ensures you won't miss new episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.